So, yeah, as I kind of alluded to earlier, we live in a country with 51 constitutions. We spend the vast majority of our time studying only one, the U.S. Constitution. Um, but we live in a country where each state has its own state constitution. And this is really important to John Marshall's reasoning in this case. He says, look, the U.S. Constitution was ordained and established by the people of the entire country for themselves, for their own government as a nation, and not for the government of an individual state, right? Because each state has its own constitution to take care of things at the state level, right? He says exactly this in this next quotation. Each state established a constitution for itself, right? And that's state constitutions don't just provide for the election of governors and state legislatures and school boards and stuff like that. Each state constitution has its own Bill of Rights as well. So, why does all of this matter? Marshall says in the several constitutions, in other words, in the state constitutions, they have imposed such restrictions on their respective governments as their own wisdom suggested. And this is true, right? Some state constitutions are super aggressive in respecting rights, others are a little less. And each state is allowed to customize their own constitution as they deem most proper for themselves. It is a subject on which they judge exclusively. In other words, U.S. Supreme Court justices can't say anything about the Maryland Constitution. That's only up for debate in Maryland court by Maryland judges. The implication of this claim is that if Barron's rights have been violated, they have to be violating rights under the Maryland Constitution. And the Maryland courts have already weighed in and said that there was no violation of the Maryland Constitution. And so Barron is entitled to no money in compensation. The only question is, well, but what about the takings clause? Wouldn't that provide an avenue with which the U.S. Supreme Courts could say, yes, his U.S. constitutional rights have been violated, he needs to be compensated? And the answer is no, because the point of the takings clause was only to protect Barron or anybody else from having their property taken away by a decision in Congress, a decision made by the federal government, not a decision made by a state government or city government, so on and so forth. But Barron's lawyers are like, well, no. It's not so quite clear and simple that state constitutions handle state, government infractions, and the U.S. Constitution and the U.S. Bill of Rights only gets implicated when the U.S. government tries to take away rights. They say, what about Article 1, Section 10? Now, remember, based on what we discussed last time in Ex parte Merriment, we've already discussed a couple of sections in Article 1. Article 1 is all about Congress, how it's organized, how many powers it has. And then we're going to spend a lot of time throughout the semester talking about Article 1, Section 8, which is the list of things that Congress has the power to do. And then Article 1, Section 9, which was also is discussed in Ex parte Merriment, is a list of limitations, things that Congress cannot do. In Article 1, Section 10, you get another list of thou shalt nots, just like in Article 1, Section 9. Except in Article 1, Section 10, these are a list of things that that state governments cannot do. No state can enter into any treaty or alliance with other countries. Believe it or not, this was a problem under the Articles of Confederation, the document we had before the U.S. Constitution was enacted. It's a really, really bad idea to have individual states making their own deals with other countries, right? No state can issue their own money. That used to be the case before the Constitution was enacted. Could you imagine having to handle an exchange rate if you went down to Virginia for the weekend and needed to convert your Maryland money into Virginia money? Right, so there are all these list of things that state governments cannot do. And so Barron argues that this shows that the Constitution actually doesn't just protect people from infractions of rights committed by the federal government, but also protects people from infractions of rights committed by state governments as well. Well, Marshall disagrees. Here's Marshall's rebuttal to that notion. Article 1, Section 10 shows that states are only prohibited from doing those things that are listed because it says no states shall. In other words, if we go back to the previous slide, you've got, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? 6, 7, 8, like 9 things on this list. Nowhere in this list of 9 does it say that no state shall take away property without just compensation. So if it's not on the list, the U.S. Constitution doesn't protect your right against state governments doing something like that. Only if your state constitution says no state, no city government, no county government shall take property without just compensation. So again, you're out of luck. And there's a logic, there's a reason why Article 1, Section 10 forbids states from doing 10 things and only those 10 things. Because the things that are on that list, that if states were allowed to do those 10 things, it would undercut the federal government's power. And again, let me go back to that slide, right? If state governments are allowed to enter treaties, that undermines the federal government's ability to negotiate treaties with foreign countries. If states are allowed to coin their own money, it undermines the federal government's ability to coin money, so on and so forth, right? So, it might suck what happens to John Barron, but it's not unconstitutional because the U.S. Constitution does not protect those kinds of rights from infringement by state or local governments, only if Congress tried to do it. And then here's the interesting thing. We go back to discussing Article 1, Section 9, because in this, as we saw in Article 1, Section 10, it was no state shall do this, no state shall do that, no state, no state, no state, no state, right? But in Article 1, Section 9, sometimes the restrictions here are very, very clear that the federal government is the one that is being forbidden from doing something. So in Article 1, Section 9, it says no title of nobility shall be granted by the United States, by the federal government. But sometimes in Article 1, Section 9, the restriction is expressed in general terms. No bill of attainder or ex post facto law shall be passed. And the problem here is it doesn't specify by whom. By Congress? By the states? By both? So, Marshall's argument here is that doesn't matter. All of the things listed in Article 1, Section 9, they only apply to actions taken by the federal government. So why does all of this matter to the Bill of Rights? Well, again, here's the thing. The First Amendment is quite clear, right? Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, abridging free speech, right? There are a whole bunch of other First Amendment rights. But it's the point is every right listed in the First Amendment, it is clear who cannot do the violating, Congress. But the Fifth Amendment is written in general terms. It's not clear who is being restricted, right? Because, again, remember, I already showed you this before, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. And, it seems like, well, maybe what this means is nor shall state governments take private property. Again, so the Fifth Amendment is written in general terms, but Marshall says it still only applies to when the federal government takes private property and does not compensate the owners. Now, so Barron loses. He ends up getting no money. It sucks, right? Here's the thing. If this case took place today, would the Fifth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution be violated if Maryland tried to do this thing? The answer, believe it or not, is yes. Because after Barron versus Baltimore was decided and after the Civil War was over, the 14th Amendment was added to the U.S. Constitution, and the 14th Amendment said state governments cannot deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And what that word liberty, there's a reason why I've underlined it. The word liberty has been interpreted over many, many court cases to include most of the rights listed in the Bill of Rights. So state governments cannot deprive any citizen of liberty, and liberty we mean freedom of speech, freedom of religion, the right to bear arms, the right to be free from unreasonable searches and seizures, and the right not to have your property taken without just compensation. This is called this making the Bill of Rights applicable to violations of both state and federal governments. This move that the Supreme Court made to interpret the 14th Amendment as creating more restrictions against state governments, that's called incorporation doctrine. It's not a major focus of this course, but it will when you take First Amendment freedoms. So again, if Barron was going to win, he would have to win based on his rights under the Maryland Constitution being violated, right? So if he couldn't, at the time that this case was decided, if he couldn't turn to the U.S. Constitution for support, right, what rights could he claim? Well, here's the thing. The Maryland Constitution, in its Declaration of Rights, contains an article that said that no freeman ought to be disseised of his freehold, liberties, or privileges, or deprived of his life, liberty, or property, but by the lawful judgment of his peers or by the law of the land. And this is not a takings clause, right? Barron was not but what this means is that the Maryland Constitution was worded differently than the kinds of rights protected in the U.S. Constitution. Why does this matter? Because the city didn't specifically target Barron for unfair treatment, right? It's not like they were like, okay, we need to divert these streams, and you know what? We know that it's going to cause dirt to get moved. Screw that John Barron guy. We don't like him, right? If the city had done that, then he would have been entitled to compensation. But because it just sort of happened, right, that the dirt came down and settled across all of the harbor, then his rights weren't violated, and he couldn't go to state court to claim compensation. And, you know, that kind of sucks. And what also kind of sucks is that you couldn't get a Maryland judge to interpret this part of the Maryland Constitution in a new way that would allow him to collect some money. Do you know why? Well, in those days, state judges were chosen exclusively by the governor. And guess what? The governor thinks that expanding the city of Baltimore and building new houses and new neighborhoods is a really good idea, right? And so guess what? The judges that the governor appointed are not going to take very kindly to some guy going into court and being like, oh, we got to get the city government to pay me because, like, my business has been undermined, right? The judges got appointed by the governor. The judges can be gotten rid of by the governor, right? And so no state judge is going to, try to help Barron out. And that kind of seems unfair, right? That, like, the whole point of going to court is to have your case judged by a neutral third party. And it doesn't seem like the state judges are all that neutral here. And so, like I said, you know, who did you think these state judges were going to side with? They're going to side with the person who appointed them, the governor of the state of Maryland. So poor John Barron, he ran into kind of a buzzsaw in this case, and it was because that, like, you know, people really didn't like judges being so closely tied to the politics of, like, the governor of their state that they eventually, including Maryland, decided that state judges should be elected, because that way judges might be a little bit more loyal to the people and less so to the politically powerful members of the politics in their state. What could be a fair short answer question in this case? One, why did Barron want to get his case in federal courts to begin with? Right, we just talked about that near the end, that judges in state courts weren't going to give him a fair shake. Right? Why is Barron versus Baltimore mostly overturned today? It's because the 14th Amendment means that most provisions in the Bill of Rights It is unconstitutional for Congress to violate those rights, but also for state and local governments. So that's it. This is a case about, which courts have authority to hear which kinds of cases. So I hope you've learned a little bit about America's constitutional system that involves lots of different constitutions and different levels of court systems that have different powers, and you can have different rights in different kinds of documents. In general, that probably makes us a freer society. But man, in the case of John Barron, he was not loving the way that the Constitution was set up at that time. Again, if you have any questions, I hope you're pausing the video throughout to post them in perusal, and I'll see you guys next week. Thanks so much.